Good afternoon.
And I'm just going to record the session. Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. I know this is not our standard meeting time that we normally get together, but changing it up a little bit. And definitely appreciate everybody taking the time to connect and be here. So super excited today. As you know, like we typically get together for our support specialist professional development based on conversations with all of you, and definitely the like looking at the feedback surveys in terms of topics and support that you all have been looking for. One of the big topics that has been coming up is wanting more development and opportunities to have conversations around diversity, around race and ethnicity. So as our growth sector team started talking about it a little bit more, I was really just like sort of like racking my brain in terms of like what we could do and like what would make sense, and had the opportunity to connect with an old colleague slash peer slash mentor, Dr. Musu, who actually was a few years ahead of me in my graduate program at Syracuse University. So super excited that we have that connection. And as you all know, love to bring in Syracuse alum to connect with our group. So our topic today is C.A.R.E, we're calling it, Conversations About Race and Ethnicity, hosted by Dr. Musu. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Musu to get us started.
Hey, everybody. So thank you so much, Cheryl, for the introduction and for having me. I'm really excited to be with you guys today, virtually, wherever you are. I'm happy to be in your space. So thank you so much for your openness to our dialogue we're going to have today and the topics that we're going to discuss. So I want to give you a sense of where we're going today and kind of what our goals are, but I always like to start workshops with a story. So we'll be talking about identity and self-reflection, and I just want to give you kind of a sense of where we start with identity and self-reflection. And I just realized I'm not sharing, so let me share my screen so that you can see these beautiful slides. So when we think about identity, the topics I want us to focus on today is really thinking about our own self-reflection in addition to our students' identities and how those different identities that we have, as well as our students, play a role in the way that we work with them or support them, and also how we perceive them, because we're human, right? And so, the feelings and biases and experiences that we have play a role in the way that we influence or impact or spend time with our students as well. So hopefully we can get to a place of self-reflection, as well as some enhanced awareness about what role identity plays in our work with our students. So I want to start with a story. Some of the research I've had the wonderful opportunity to do has focused on the experiences of undergraduate Black women, in particularly really talented students. And in one of the interviews I had for the book that I just wrote, I had a really wonderful, very loquacious young woman who was a first-year biology student. And she was at a major research university, hardcore STEM community, so lots of folks who are coming from all over the country to study at this institution. And so she was in an honors community there, which, to us says she's got really excellent credentials, wonderful GPA, SAT, all those kinds of things to get into that program. But there were several times in my interview with her about her experiences at college that she expressed doubt or worry or concern about her ability to be successful within the community of other STEM students, and how self-conscious she felt about the various identities she had within her community or her STEM context. So one of the things that she shared with me was that she'd known from a really young age that she wanted to go into a health profession. And as soon as she could, she figured out that she wanted to study a particular kind of cancer in pediatrics, and that she was on a mission to do what she needed to do so that she could get exposure and access to that kind of a career. She didn't know anybody who studied those things or who did that kind of research or pediatric support, but that's what she wanted to do. So there was a lack of models. She trusted she could be successful because her family, instilled that in her, but there was a lack of models and there was a lack of a clear path. And so here she was, smack in the middle of this STEM community. And despite having really wonderful potential and high potential, she was still really concerned about her ability to succeed. So one of the things she mentioned to me, though, was that in her calculus class, she was the only person who looked like her. So she was a West African immigrant. She was a first-generation American, and she was not a first-generation student, but she had not had family who'd done education here in the United States. And so she said she's good at math, or she thought she was good at math, but now that she was in college, when she was in her calculus class, she found herself second-guessing herself about whether or not she knew the right answer and if she would participate in class. And if she did participate in class and she was wrong, she was very worried about how that would look, not just for herself, but for people who look like her. And so what she shared with me was that she really felt like she had to prove herself in a way. She didn't raise her hand in class or offer responses to questions that she knew the answer to. So this is not somebody who doesn't know the answer and is afraid to fail. This is somebody who pretty much knows the answer, right? Like has some insight or experience and knows the answer, but did not want to raise her hand for fear of how people would interpret her response based on the way she looked or the identities that she had. So she felt she had to prove herself in a way. And so she said, that's why I study so hard for my tests, because I want them to know I'm much more than just what they see. So think about that. This really talented student or high potential student, like the students you're working with, have an awareness or a skill that they're hiding, right? Like they're self-silencing because they're concerned about how the folks in their community, academically or socially, are going to respond to the way they're performing in their spaces, right? So like that fear of self-doubt, that anger perhaps around whether or not they can be their authentic selves in the classroom. She felt tokenized, right? And so some of this also hints at some of the emotional challenges that our students face, right, as underrepresented minorities in various aspects of their STEM experience, where they really are forced to manage all of these additional concerns in ways that other students or majority students don't have to, right? So I just like to start with that story because I feel like it gives us a framework for thinking about the unique experiences or the ways that identity plays a role in how students experience college or their academic disciplines. And so for our agenda today, here's what we're going to talk about. As I mentioned, we're going to focus on becoming more self-aware through some review of some research. I won't be too heavy on the research. I want it to be engaging. And so I'll be asking you questions and you can comment in the chat and that sort of thing. But we'll talk about some research on different aspects of identity. We'll also have some time for self-reflection. So you had your pre-worksheet before our event. So you had a chance to kind of do some self-reflection on things that you're aware of in terms of your identity or aspects, maybe that you brought to light as you were doing that reflection exercise that maybe you don't think about often. And we'll do some small group discussion in breakout rooms. So you'll have a chance to work in a small group and perhaps feel more comfortable sharing about personal identity related things than rather in the big group, and then we'll come back together. So the final piece is thinking about taking action. Some of that will happen in our second session, but I do want to invite you at the end when we come back together in our big group to make sure that you are thinking about what are some strategies you can employ or sharing strategies that you discussed in your small group with the larger group so that we can think about ways to support students. Okay, so if you have questions, you can throw them in the chat. I'm going to open that on my screen so that I can see them when you have a question. And I will make sure that I include the folks who are responding in the chat as I'm talking. So I'll try to be multitasking while I present so I make sure I don't miss any comments kind of real time. All right. So here's a little bit more about me. This is kind of like my own identity wheel, but I like to share this kind of word cloud with folks so that you know where I'm situated. Some of the fun things about me is that I love HGTV. I feel like that is at the forefront of my identity when I'm not at work. I'm all about Bravo. Anybody else? Housewives? Atlanta, Potomac. Very excited about the new seasons coming up. So in my life outside of the office and my non-researcher life, that is like hardcore who I am. I also am a former student athlete. So I had that experience while I was an undergraduate, and that was a huge piece of my identity. So when we get to the wheel and we start talking about pieces of the wheel or pieces of your identity that meant a lot to you, that was a huge one for me, kind of unexpectedly. I'm also a daughter, I am a mother, I'm a partner, I am a sister, I always forget that one. I'm a sister. I'm a big sister and a younger sister. So that's a big part of my identity as well. And then some of the other things that I've included on here are my religious identity, some personal preferences. I love jazz. I think when I was looking at the growth sector website, I saw a couple of the colleagues in the main unit like jazz, and I was like, these are my people. So that's exciting. And then a little bit more about me academically or intellectually. So as Cheryl mentioned, we both were in the higher ed program at Syracuse University. And then after that, several years later, I spent about 16 years working in higher education. So I've done a little bit of everything and worked with lots of different kinds of students at a variety of different kinds of institutions. But I went back and got my PhD in urban education. And so essentially, I'm an expert on students' experiences inside and outside the classroom at urban institutions, but particularly focused on the experiences of high achieving undergraduate Black women. And I like to learn more about their experiences inside and outside the classroom, because as you all probably know, learning happens everywhere, right? And students spend so much of their time outside the classroom. And those social interactions and connections play a huge role in how they adjust or feel like they fit or don't at their institution, in the same way that their interactions in a classroom do. So similarly, you all are in kind of like this gray area space, right? Like you're supporting students in their academic interests and pursuits, but you're also outside the classroom and you're getting to know them and you're advising them. So all of that work is really important, and I'm excited to hear more about how all of you reflect on that as we move through the presentation. So part of your pre-work was to look at the identity wheel, which I included on your worksheet, and think about ways that your identity is important to you, or examples of experiences where you felt aware of your identities, or identities that you hadn't really thought about because looking at this identity wheel made you feel a little bit more self-conscious or self-aware. So that's a good thing. What I wanted to know in the chat, if you feel comfortable, is based on this wheel, which identities were salient for you? So salience really is a term used in the research on identity that means like how important or how essential to your identity or how you think of yourself as your authentic self were different identities that you reflected on through the worksheet. So you can feel free to share in the chat. And the question was, which identities were salient for you? Based on the wheel. And so while you're putting in your responses, I'll just share with you that, yes, thinking styles, communication styles, skills, education. Yeah. So I think one of the things that's really helpful about this wheel is thinking about both personal identities as well as social identities. So I'm going to show you the next page just so you can see what I'm talking about, and then we'll go back to the wheel, right? So when we think about identity, we have social identities and we have personal identities. So the social identities are really the ones that are kind of defined by like group status or membership, and they often reflect our relationship to others. So they might be socially defined or socially designated, right? So like race, social class, those kinds of things, right? Those are classifications outside ourselves that are related to us or ascribed to us based on how we kind of function in society. And then we have personal identities, and those are really associated with our preferences or our choices or inherent things about ourselves that we can't really change, right? And sometimes either of those can shift, right? So our social identities might shift over time. Think about like marital status, right? That shifts over time. Or we might develop further in our identity. So sexual orientation might change as we become more mature or become more reflective in what our experiences are, right? So those are the social and the personal identities that the identity wheel here helps us reflect on. So I see some more answers. I see race, ethnicity, nationality. Yeah, so where you were born, socioeconomic status, race, gender. We talked about marital status, education, religious belief, and geographic status. Yeah, I think especially for this group, because we're virtual, it's really interesting to think about how geography and like where we're located in the country impacts the way that we perceive our students or work with our students or what their needs are in the communities that we're serving. Yeah, mom and aunt, where would that be? That's a good one. I don't think there's a good family category here. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. I don't feel like that's quite parental status, right? Or for aunt, or, well, parental status goes to mom. So maybe we can like attach aunt to mom, right? But yeah, so your familiar status, and that shifts, right? Depending on what the structure of your family looks like. Thinking styles, education. Great. So one of the things I noticed and anticipated was that you probably came up with a few of the identities that fit in this wheel, that you're very aware of, that other people respond to also, right? So people might notice those things about you quickly. They may not notice your education, right? Unless they're making assumptions about you. But they probably notice or make assumptions about your gender. They absolutely make assumptions about your race, right? Because race is a socially constructed idea based on how we look. They may take signals about your economic status or other things about you based on the way you dress or how you carry yourself. So thinking about these identity pieces that are on this wheel are really helpful for just gaining self-reflection and self-awareness, and also honing in on the ways that we interpret or perceive the students that we're working with and supporting as well. So for me, I'll say, in college, kind of putting the student perspective on this, and you're welcome to share more in the chat about your own students. One of the things that was really challenging for me was I had a lot of identity development around my sexual orientation. And I think in high school, I kind of knew, but I wasn't in a community where it was supported to be anything besides like hyper straight. And I say that because I went to an all-girls school. Everybody was boy crazy. And we were all expected to be boy crazy. And if you weren't boy crazy, it was like, what is wrong with you, right? And so our social context really kind of facilitated leaning toward being like boy crazy as kind of standard performance of our gender, but also of our sexual orientation, right? There wasn't space for other kinds of performances of self. And then also, I was very conscious of being one of the only Black girls in my graduating class and in my school. So race was a very sensitive, salient identity for me, mostly thinking about how other people interacted with me, and then going to college too, thinking about other people are interacting with me because of, or choosing to interact with me in this way because of how I look, right? And what they think about what Black girls do and where Black girls go, right? And putting together those two identities. So for the sake of kind of thinking about this from a more concrete perspective, I will let you know that as we talk about identities in kind of the next few slides, we're talking about it. We'll attempt to talk about it separately as separate identities, but the reality is, and maybe you've experienced this yourself, is that some of these are really just inextricably linked, right? So I have difficulty thinking about myself as just a Black person, right? Or just a mom, or just, a PhD, because there's so many other things that play a role in how I see myself or how other people see me. So we're going to attempt in some ways to talk about these identities separately, just for the sake of discussion and kind of reflection. And you're welcome to put your comments in the chat. You can continue doing that. But also, as you've experienced that in your own reflections, it's kind of difficult to talk about them alone. And much of the research that I'll talk about really does address several of these aspects together. There's not much recent literature that just talks about race, right, as if there's no other identities, or just gender as if there's no other identities. They're really combining those two things, or several aspects of identity, in the research on undergraduate students. So the cool thing about that is when I was in grad school the first time, that was not the case. Right. So several years ago, even, a lot of the research was really in response to the lack of diversity reflected in prior research, or kind of the major theoretical perspectives in the field of education were only studying white men, straight white men who went to predominantly white institutions, often state institutions, right? And so, and they were in homogenous environments. And now, wonderfully enough, we've got lots of research that talks about students' experiences with race or identity and intersectionality in really wonderful, robust ways. So the only other thing I'll say as kind of a preface to our discussion is just, have any of you heard of intersectionality? So it's a theoretical perspective, lots of not awesome. I love it. Okay. So thinking about identity as not just I'm more than one thing, but intersectionality kind of posits that all of our identities, and particularly for Black women, so intersectionality was developed kind of focusing on the experiences of Black women who are under-resourced and understudied in education. But it focuses on how Black women occupy a particularly dynamic space in social circumstances because they are at the center of multiple oppressions. And lots of other people have that experience too, right? So some of the other students you're working with might be Latinx and woman, and they're also in STEM, right? Or they might be Asian and low income, right? So those identities play a role. But the point is that they're mutually influential, right? So we can't just be Asian or we can't just be, lesbian. It's like there are other things that impact our understanding of the world and the way people respond to us. So just wanted us to keep that idea in mind, this idea of intersectionality in mind, as we think about or navigate the importance of social phenomena like race and class and gender over the next few minutes. Okay, so I have this here, but I would like to know kind of what STEM identity is to you, because you're working with students who are aspiring STEM professionals, right? The literature says that STEM identity is essentially the association between the self and STEM disciplines, or the connection that students feel with their discipline or their academic interests, and that those associations are really moderated by how important or central to their sense of authentic self the STEM discipline or career path is for them, right? So the important thing here is not just that they're interested in STEM, but how important or essential is their commitment to or connection with STEM to how they view themselves. So as a student athlete, for me, I like to think about it this way, is like when I started college, I was not thinking like I'm an athlete. I was like, I walked onto the field hockey team. I like met somebody at orientation and she's like, you should play. And I was like, okay. But over time, what ended up happening was I became very committed to that identity and I became very immersed in my community, the athletic community, and I became very connected with my classmates or my teammates. And so where it started off as just some aspect of my identity or a thing I do became very central to how I viewed myself and how other people viewed me by the time I was a senior. So similarly, when we think about, STEM identity, really is about that association, kind of that commitment to STEM or not lack of commitment, right? The research also talks about it as a social psychological construct, right? So it's created or thought about in terms of how students are interacting with others within the field. And the important piece about it is that especially for underrepresented students who are in STEM, it is the key predictor for whether or not they persist in STEM disciplines. So whether or not a student has a fully formed or is embracing their STEM identity or their connection or commitment to their STEM identity or the discipline plays a big role in whether or not they stay in their STEM discipline or if they leave early. Sometimes they talk about a leaky pipeline, right? And we know it's like, it's really not, the pipeline's not really leaking, right? It's that there's a lack of exposure and a lack of commitment and a lack of opportunities for exploration that prevents students from even getting into the pipeline in the first place, right? We know that from the work that all of you are doing. We also know that STEM identity can be fostered and further encouraged through mentoring opportunities, immersing students in groups with like-minded underrepresented peers in their disciplines, and also creating opportunities for students to explore STEM in ways that feel low risk or allow them to have opportunities to fail or consider other opportunities than the ones they arrived with, right? So if you only knew what an engineer was and the only idea of engineering you knew was that civil engineers build roads, right? They design roads. How will you know that maybe biomedical engineering is like the perfect field for you because it combines all your wonderful interests if you never got exposed to it? So that STEM identity really is important, and especially for underrepresented minority students, but also, for general students as well. And so the importance of diversifying STEM classrooms and enhancing students' access or exposure to STEM careers is so paramount to their persistence. So tell me more about race. What is race? What even is that? What do you think that is? You can put it in the chat or you can unmute if you want to kind of like take a stab at it. And do we all have a race? I feel like that, ooh, that's a tenuous question, right? Do we all have race? Yeah, social construct based on appearances, absolutely. And why do we have race? Why do we like care about race, or do we? Why do other people care about race, I guess? So essentially, race is, as I mentioned earlier, a socially constructed category. So right on, Becca, for offering that in the chat. And it was created to differentiate racial groups, racial, using the word in the definition, but differentiate groups to show superiority or dominance of one race in particular, right? So the way that American society is set up, and several other societies, is that in order to, yes, put people into categories. In order to put people into categories, we have to think about where they fall in terms of their relation to whiteness. That is often how American society functions, right? And so we think about lots of historical practices that have impacted different communities of underrepresented folks in the United States based on the way they look, right? Like redlining policies in urban areas, or lack of access to acceptable school districts or things of that nature, and how that is related, right, to how society defines what race is. So I'm curious how significant race is to life on your campus. Are you in a community that's really racially diverse? Are you aware of that? Do you not notice? You can put that in the chat, or you can unmute. Also, you're welcome to kind of chime in. But I'm really curious about how salient it is for you, or how significant it is for you kind of in your daily life or your work with students. And then the other side of that, if you prefer to share kind of about your own experience, is thinking back to your college experience. What did it mean in your context? How important was race to your own college experience? And were you aware of that? Oh, great, wonderful. So a lot of your campuses identify as Hispanic serving institutions or HBCUs. That's awesome. So what's great about that is that because you're in communities where there tend to be more students who at predominantly white institutions are historically underrepresented, there are more examples of folks who are in STEM disciplines, who are providing models for what a scientist of color looks like, or a scientist of low income background initially looks like, and more access to, examples of options. Becca offered racially diverse college here, both Hispanic serving. All right, awesome. But not the college you went to. Okay. Patricia lives in a neighborhood that's very gentrified. Thank you. Yeah, and there's still a great divide. So there's an aspect of privilege and power too at play, right? When we think about race and how that works. And a great divide with our Black students. Yeah, thank you, Patricia, for sharing that, about reflecting on the racial makeup of your institution. That's really helpful. Okay. So some of the research that you might be interested in if you want to learn more is Solorzano, Ceja, and Yoso. And they are researchers who focus on the experiences of undergraduate students as well, but they have a critical race perspective often in their work. And so when I talk about, the idea of relation to whiteness is kind of how race is defined socially in America, they are a good resource for more information about that. So another area is thinking about gender, and we can, I will assume, based on the work that you do, that you already know that women are underrepresented in STEM fields. In particular, we know that women tend to be less in fewer of these classrooms, right, where our students are. So we see fewer women engineers, although wonderfully, those statistics are increasing with the onset of organizations like yours, but also with the hard work of institutions offering student organizations and mentoring opportunities and connections with alumni to help facilitate the connection building and sense of support and community among women, particularly in STEM fields. So women scientists, most institutions have a society of women engineers or women engineers in bioengineering. There's lots of honor societies. So we're seeing that more institutions are providing those kinds of resources, but we already know, because of the work that we're doing, that there is an underrepresentation of women in STEM. We also know that students lack exposure, often from low income backgrounds, to STEM opportunities or awareness of STEM careers or paths, and lack examples often. So in the underrepresented or lower income communities where schools are underfunded and under-resourced, often there is not space or funding to offer students opportunities like the internships that Growth Sector offers, or connection to professionals in the field who are doing work that students may not even know exists, right? So my example about engineering, they might know they want to be an engineer because that sounds cool, or they know they need math and science, but they really don't know what an engineer does. I have a colleague who we've known each other since we were children, and she's an environmental engineer. And so she goes into schools in our home community, which is fairly under-resourced, and she just goes to offer career talks to talk to them about, like, here's what engineers like me do, and here's what I studied in school, and here are some ways you can get exposure. And it's kind of opportunities like that really make a huge difference in what students feel like is possible. Also, I think for low-income students, there's also, and first-gen students, we know that there's a lack of freedom to dream, right? Or consider, or be willing to take the big risk of trying the new field or avenue that nobody in the family has taken. So in theory, or like idealistically, first generation students many times are encouraged to go to school, go learn, go be great, go graduate, go get a job, go get a career, right? But there's no steps to teach them how to do that. So the work that you do is really important because you help create a path, right? You help show them a way, and there's a model. But within their own communities, there may not be those options or those opportunities. And so we know that lower socioeconomic status also equates with fewer access to resources or opportunities or models of what STEM can look like, in real life. Thanks, Becca, for sharing that. She said she didn't know what an engineer was or did until college, so she left college. At a past institution, we had geographic information systems as a major. Like, what? I had no idea what that was. And like, I've been in advising for years, and I got to this school and it was like a big deal. And it's funny because at the time when I started at that institution, this idea of geocaching, students were doing geocaching for fun. And all the GIS majors were just like loving their lives because they were creating, geocache like playlists for their friends and stuff. And they would spend the weekend like finding these sites and looking them up. And like, that's a form of science. It's one that, so few students know exists, but it's totally up lots of students' alleys if they just knew, more about it. So getting back to the identity wheel, thank you for sharing, in the chat of your reflections on what you think is important or how you've reflected on your own experience. I just want to reiterate that, we know that these identities really can't be considered just by themselves. And as I mentioned, a lot of the research talks about them together. So Black women in engineering, Latina women in, science and technology, low income students in STEM, those are really major intersections that we want to make sure we pay attention to. And also that we acknowledge those play a role in how students perceive their commitment or alienation from their participation in STEM disciplines. So in my own research, one of the things that I found was that students really connected with this idea of like their academic identity and their gender identity and their racial identity. They couldn't, when they talked to me, separate those three ideas. And even when we tried to think about like, well, how important is gender? Or like, when are you aware that you're Black? It was always like, I'm aware I'm a Black woman in my honors classroom, or I'm aware that I'm a woman of color in my calc class. Like, it was very specific. And so similarly, even for students who are in Hispanic HSIs or historically Black institutions, there are other aspects of their identity that play a role or they're very aware of in those contexts, even when race is not the primary, factor that other people are responding to. So thank you so much for sharing your reflection on your identities. You can still feel free to share more. I'm actually kind of curious as we switch into this next segment, what were the identity pieces of yourself, so your authentic self, kind of reflecting on the identity wheel, that you felt were less visible? So somebody can make an assumption about your race or your gender or make other assumptions about your appearance, right? But what are some of the identities you have that this worksheet you did before today helps you reflect on, ones that were less visible? And how do they play a role in, your life or your social interactions? Sexual orientation, native born status, education, parental status, absolutely. Yeah, some of these, I'll say for myself, I'm so hyper aware sometimes about my parental status. Like I want to just be the boss at work. I don't always want to talk about my kids, but if somebody asks me, like I have to have, you're a bad parent if you don't have the photo ready, right? You're supposed to always have a photo ready. So this performance of what it means to be a parent in different spaces looks different, right? Education, work background, absolutely. Socioeconomic background for sure. Age, absolutely. Yeah, so these are ones that are a little bit less visible, but they still play a role in the way that we perceive ourselves, right? Or we perceive that other people kind of interact with us. So regardless of where students fall on the spectrum for each of the identities that I showed you in the wheel, or sometimes because of their vulnerability for various aspects of their identity, one of the values in our work with students really should be on helping them foster a sense of belonging. And that's belonging at the institution, or belonging in the field that they're considering pursuing, right? So in the STEM discipline or kind of more broadly their STEM identity. But we're really trying to foster a sense of belonging in the spaces or the context in which they work with us, right? So the last thing we want to do, obviously intentionally, is to make a student feel uncomfortable or unwelcome, or to feel ostracized or pointed out or spotlighted because of some aspect of their identity that they're really sensitive about. So having a good sense of kind of how you reflect on those things and being aware of the fact that students have different kinds of backgrounds and experiences, and they do play a role in how they perceive how you communicate with them, really is kind of the groundwork for thinking about what sense of belonging can mean in the work that we're doing. So we also know for sense of belonging, kind of thinking research oriented wise, is that interactions that students and faculty have, and I'll say staff here too, even though there's less research on that, but interactions that students and faculty have inside and outside the classroom play a role in student satisfaction, their sense of belonging, and their commitment to college, and also their retention, right? So students who's consistently having negative experiences in their classroom or negative experiences with their advisor or their classmates is not going to stay. And so that definitely plays a role in, even with all of the interventions that an organization like Growth Sector offers, if students are having negative interactions in other spaces that they frequent very often, that's going to impact whether or not they stay at the institution and whether or not they stay the path and graduate as a STEM major. So that's an essential piece of our work for students. And so I want to move forward. I see a question in the chat. Why is neurodivergence not on the wheel? There should be neurodivergence on the wheel. I didn't make the wheel, but if I remade the wheel, I would add that because that's something for me as well. And I think thinking styles is definitely a piece of identity for lots of people, particularly folks who identify as neurodivergent. Like there's a heightened awareness about, what that means in our interactions with others. So moving on, I think the sense of belonging research, I'll be brief here, is really focused on thinking about fit and how students perceive their fit or their welcomeness in their discipline or at their institution or whatever community or context they're in. And so we talked about the interactions between faculty and students and how that plays a role in graduation and retention. But also to be a little bit more specific, it really is just about fit and how connected students feel. It's also about thinking through the connection that students have with their discipline or their commitment to it. So some of the research talks about I'll give you a quote, that as an academic context, right, or thinking about belonging in academic contexts like schools and universities, sense of belonging is defined as feeling accepted or valued or supported by the STEM community and its members, right? So not just feeling like I can do the work, but feeling like my professor knows I can do the work and knows I belong here. And my classmate trusts that I can do the work and I belong here. Sense of belonging also predicts STEM identity. So we talked about that a little bit, and I've got some more information for you about that in a moment. Academic performance, and it's particularly important for STEM persistence among underrepresented minorities, right? So the particular population you're working with, it's super important to whether or not they graduate. So the other side of that, so we talked about fit, right? And this kind of a more positive aspect of the construct, but the opposite side of it is alienation or omission or being spotlighted, right? And so those different experiences are also really important as we think about sense of belonging and how we understand students' connection to their community. So one piece of research that talks about students, particularly who are STEM undergrads and STEM identities, says that Black girls represent a unique population of primary through secondary school learners that remain essentially untapped as a resource for potential STEM majors. So thinking about how we talked about this earlier, and access and exposure to STEM careers and STEM education, or STEM models, right, of people who've done STEM and been successful who look like them. There is a whole pool of students who could benefit from those kinds of experiences, many of whom find their way to you all, which is great. But they really do, broadly speaking, lack access to those opportunities. And so much of the research on the development of Black girls' STEM identities or other underrepresented minority STEM identities highlights the importance of STEM attitudes, right? So their perception of what STEM means or how successful they can be in shaping them as STEM learners and their persistence in STEM, right? So if you're constantly in a space where you feel like you don't fit, or other people are making you feel like you don't fit, or your professor questions if you fit, then that identity threat, so that's kind of the term that Claude Steele uses, really plays a role in whether you perceive you fit there and if you want to stay. Because you have to think about self-preservation, you have to think about how realistic it is that you'll be able to finish the program if you're not getting support, or you don't feel supported enough. Or, you know, if you've had an early challenge in a course, like a math course or a science course, and you therefore are worried about whether or not you're going to be successful in the future, regardless of your racial identity, all of that plays a role in whether or not you feel threatened or safe or welcome or capable in the major that students have chosen to pursue. So let's shift gears. We're going to do a little bit of discussion. I want you to think about how sense of belonging and our identities, or our student identities, play a role in the ways that we work with our students or think about their own identity. So I'm going to put us in breakout rooms. I'll try to do pairs, and I'm going to give you, we'll do maybe 8 minutes. So we have time at the end for us to come back together. But these are the questions you're going to be thinking about. So if you want to start reflecting on these, I'm going to put you into breakout rooms and we will jump into our discussion. So you'll be thinking about your top 5 most salient identities. So some of you shared maybe the first 3, like your race and your gender, but I really want you to open up a little bit and think about your top 5 or your major 5 salient identities. I also would like for you to think about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we'll do 4 breakout rooms. I also want you to think about which aspects of your identity you are now more cognizant of, since we've kind of had these discussions. And then in particular, I'm curious about which identities do your students have that perhaps were unfamiliar to you, that you've encountered in your work now, and what that means to you. So we'll start with those first 3. I created breakout rooms.
Is it possible
so
to put the questions in the chat? That way we
Yes, I absolutely will.
Yeah.
Yep. So I'm going to open all the rooms and then I'll share the questions to all participants in the chat. Small group discussion go.
Great. Too fast.
I know. Like we could do the whole thing, could be discussed next time. Next time will be all discussion.
Yeah, next time.
You're going to be sick of me. So how did it go? Were there identities you want to share? You can put things in the chat if you want, so that way you can share while you're also listening to other folks. And I'm going to keep sharing my screen quickly because I want to make sure that you have a chance to add to what we'll be doing next time. So thoughts from your small group discussion that you want to share with the group, you can put in the chat. I'm going to share my screen with you again. So we did our breakout discussion, and we talked about salient identities, and in particular, the ones that maybe you hadn't thought about before today. You can feel free to share those or not. That's okay. Be private if you'd like.
I can share.
Sure.
Kate and I had talked a little bit about our most salient. And I was talking a little bit about race and ethnicity, but then also like Native and non-Native. I think most people on the call know, like, I'm Canadian, and just like how that embeds into like how I interact with people, and even just like references that like friends or family, like friends and like now family, like make from like high school or like Nickelodeon. Like, what's that? Like, I didn't grow up with that. I think little things like that. And even like when it comes to like checking off the survey, African American, I don't identify as African American because I'm not American, right? So just like a lot of like those points that people don't realize that part of my identity unless I outwardly share it. Is just like something I'm always thinking about.
Thank you. Other thoughts from people? So you can add your thoughts in the chat. You'll see on your screen as we prepare for next session, so we can continue sharing, but you will have a little bit of homework, so Cheryl will follow up with you. But part of what we'll do in our discussion next time is talk about case studies and how you can share, or based on your reflections with students. I'm inviting you to share your case studies. You can do so anonymously, you don't have to put your name on them. But particular situations that either came to mind while you were doing the worksheet, so self-reflective experiences or scenarios where your identity played a role in, or you were very aware of your identity in an interaction with someone, particularly in academic spaces or professional spaces, or an interaction with a student that kind of brought your attention or made you a little bit more self-reflective about how you navigate your interaction or support for students. Constructive or maybe frustrating. So whichever way you view that, you can put that in the case study. So I have the link in the chat for the case study submission. And then if you would be so kind, you can do a quick feedback form. It's like 2 questions with this QR code here. So that'll give me a nice little understanding of how you felt about today, and if there's more things you want to talk about next time that maybe we didn't get a chance to get to. But if anybody else wants to share, we still have a couple minutes, and I'd love to hear more about your discussion together with your partners. Oh, code should be talk. Did that work? Okay. Anything else you want to share about identities or your students' identities? Or if we recreate the wheel, what should we add? Okay. So feel free to put more questions in the chat. We'll save those for later. But thank you so much for being open to learning and participating via the chat, and then also your small discussions. I really enjoyed getting to know all of you and learning more about your experiences and your backgrounds, especially in the small groups. And I look forward to seeing you next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Musu. Everybody, I will send out a reminder, but our part 2 next session will be on November 16th. Bumped up a little bit earlier. It'll be 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, but I'll send out a reminder and the link along with the homework and case study collection for next time. But huge thank you to everybody for participating and taking the time to be here, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.